as Eric had mentioned, Saugatuck has a rich history, rich maritime history amongst a lot of other things. We're fortunate we have many of the threads of those generations in the room with us right now. You know, it's great because I basically have started my career about 40-some years ago as a journalist, photographer covering events like the America's Cup, the Mackinac races, and I still continue to do that to this day. About 3.5 years ago, with my work with the Chicago Yacht Club and their race history up to Mackinac, and certainly Bayview Yacht Club on the other side of our state and their rich history up to Mackinac, they were coming up to their 150th anniversary, the club anniversary. This is actually John Prindeville. He was the first Commodore of the club in 1875. And so it's, you know, they kind of brought me on because they wanted me to do two things, to kind of investigate and look back at the 150 years of history that the club had, but more importantly, the race to Mackinac history. The first race to Mackinac was in 1898, 23 years after the club was founded. And so over the last 3.5 years, I've kind of been working with the club to kind of dig up a lot of that rich history, and with a lot of things, as people that love history know, one chapter leads to another, or one thread leads down different roads. I mean, it's funny because basically what started just, you know, investigating the history of the race, history of the club, turned into a much different project for me. So as I had mentioned earlier, the first race was in 1898, and it was organized by the Yacht Club as a long distance race. Only 5 yachts took part in the race. This is Venena. And Venena was the first winner of the first Chicago-to-Mackinac race in 1898. And this is actually a photograph of the start of that race in Chicago Harbor. And Venena was approximately a 60-footer, one of the larger racing vessels of its kind during that day. And there were probably about a dozen crew aboard. And Venena finished the race in about 51 hours, which, you know, you think, you know, wow, that's like a pretty fast time. To this day, basically, the average boats race 40, 50, 60 hours. So for a boat in 1898 to race for 51 hours up to Mackinac Island was a very impressive time. And then the second place was a boat called Hawthorne, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But so it took about 5 years before the club organized their second race to Mackinac, which was in 1904. This is another picture of Venena, the winner of that race. And then that's kind of what a little bit of the image of what it was like to be on board. You know, again, a male-driven sport, and that is going to lead to the top of our conversation. But again, as you can see, just a really, you know, hands on the wheel, you're driving into the wind, and just an exciting adventure. And again, just another shot of the boats and the arrows and the type of sail canvas that they had at that time. Again, just hard driven. And also I want to mention really quick, all the slides and images that you see here today are courtesy not only of this particular historical center and the wonderful work that they do here, but also the Chicago History Museum and their library, which is off in Lincoln Park in Chicago. And they would welcome all visitors to come and look at Chicago's rich history. But again, a lot of these slides came to the Yacht Club, which donated all of our materials back to the History Museum. So it kind of came full circle. So again, just thank you to those institutions that really capture and keep the history that we have in our lives. And again, as you can see, back in the day, there were 7 newspapers in Chicago at least. And sailing, this really predates auto racing, and baseball was in its infancy, and football hadn't really been organized in any way whatsoever. So basically, sailing was one of the big spectator sports of its time. You know, the America's Cup, which began in 1851, you know, would hold defenses in New York City, and it was like the Super Bowl. There'd be tens of thousands of people lining the shorelines, basically, watching these amazing boats race. Again, just a canvas at the start, and again, even with just 5, 6, 7 yachts on the starting line, it gets pretty crowded there pretty fast. Again, the gentleman at the helm is William Baum, who was one of the early commodores of the club. He also donated the Mackinac Cup in 1906, which became the trophy for the winner. But anyway, he not only was a commodore, but basically was a fervent competitor as well too, and he was on his boat called Vencedor. So Venena, Vencedor, Amarita, they were like the big rock star boats of its time. And again, that is a picture actually of the Mackinac Cup, which was again donated to the club as a perpetual trophy in 1906. And again, the clubhouse itself, this clubhouse was built in 1902 and it was christened in 1904. It was right on the pilings that the current yacht club sits to this day, which is at the foot of Monroe Street. But back then, you had to get a boat to get out to the yacht club, and then the yacht club was on the water, because Grant Park in its infancy was just really, at the turn of the century, was just starting to kind of be landscaped as a park. You had the Art Institute, which is one of the driving buildings of its time, and then you had the Field Museum at the other end, and those were all built around this era when the yacht club basically had its original clubhouse, which again took the club until the 1920s, and it's another story for another day. And again, as you can see, front page headline of the papers, and the sport in its era, in its time, was second to none. Again, another shot of the yacht club, and many pages of stories. This is a little bit of the interior of the club, which kind of was like swanky in its heyday. And, again, it took like about 3 months to build the club. So basically, the construction wasn't necessarily something that was meant to have lasted many generations. In fact, it didn't. It lasted 2 decades, and that was it. And then just short story, it was torn down in 1925 to make room for this palatial, what would have been the grandest yacht club in the world, and which was going to be kind of still at the foot of the pilings that the club sits on now. And then in 1929, we had basically the stock market crash, and then we had the Depression, so they had to waylay their plans for a swanky new clubhouse, and actually borrowed one of the buildings from the 1933 World's Fair and had that transported on the site as a temporary clubhouse for 20 years. So again, just this is what Chicago River and Harbor looked at back in the day, and what we're really doing. And as you can see, this is the Art Institute, kind of in its infancy. Just almost a brand new christened building. And again, as with a lot of photos of this era, not only are they black and white, but they're also smoke choked. So in 1904, the yacht club reestablished the race to Mackinac. It's 331 nautical miles. Basically, in 1904, Vencedor got its revenge on Venena, and Vencedor won the race in 1904, which leads us to 1905 and Evelyn Wright. And again, this is Vencedor, and as you can see, just a powerful, 65-foot yacht, the giants of its age. In comparison, the America's Cup yacht was 130 feet long, so it was almost twice the size. But again, the magnificence of these yachts were just marvelous. And again, just another picture. This is Amarita. And again, the rules for the yacht club in 1905, basically were as followed: that only people that were members of the club could race in the club's events, could enter boats in the club's events. And so, interesting at her time, so Evelyn Wright was born in Chicago in 1877. She was born into privilege. Her father was a well-known attorney. They had members of the family that were legislatures in Chicago and in Illinois. And again, so you're looking at 1905. So Evelyn Wright was just 27 years old. in 1905. And she chose as her crewmate on a boat called Lady Eileen, which was a 32-foot boat that was built by her brothers. And in fact, one of the brothers was George Wright, who had ended up coming to Saugatuck at later in life, and I think served on city council and was an integral part of Saugatuck politics back in the 30s and 40s. So anyway, George is one of her brothers, and her other brother basically helped build Lady Eileen. Back in the day, back in the day, this is in the infancy where yacht racing was just really getting its start. And you could get these kits that basically would literally be delivered to your doorstep. And Lady Eileen, which was 32-foot sloop, basically was built in the garage and on the property of the Wright household. And so, Evelyn Wright, who loved to sail, and she's been sailing ever since she was a wee little girl, so to speak, basically, this was given to her as a birthday present, and so, she took it out sailing for a couple ventures. She sailed it up to Macatawa, and then on the return to get the boat back in Chicago for the race, she had to sail through gale force winds just to get the boat back to Chicago to line up for the start of the infamous race. And with her, she brought her, at that time was only 17-year-old cousin, Sara Carey, who liked to be known as Sally, was kind of more of her nickname, but her name was Sara Carey. She was Evelyn's cousin, and so the two ladies initially, when they were getting ready to sail in the 1905 race, they were hoping to have 4 women crew members as part of the race. And what ended up happening is one of the ladies that were gonna, and again, as all-women crew, this was unprecedented for its time. I mean, you had basically, this was a male-dominated sport. You had very few women who would basically be bold enough to not only be a flag member of the Chicago Yacht Club, and a flag member meant that they were able to fly the yacht club flag in their vessel when they raced in a club event. She was the first and only flag member of the club, and as has been argued by many historians, a flag member in all actuality has all the same memberships and rights as regular members. But then she was the only flag member woman in the Chicago Yacht Club. At that time, the New York Yacht Club, which was very prestigious, most prestigious yacht club in the world, had no women members and no women flag cup members. And so basically, in 1905, we get to the point where basically the yacht race was going to start in an area called the Van Buren Street Gap. And 9 boats were going to race in the Mackinac Race. 13 other boats were going to race in a race to Macatawa. Basically, all of those boats would have basically raced in the Mackinac Race, but Vencedor and Venena, which were the 2 big yachts of their time, their owners, back then, everybody bet on things. That was the big thing. The owners basically would bet on the races and who would win. And apparently there was a $500 bet in a race to Milwaukee between the 2 boats that basically there was a dispute at the finish. They finished neck and neck. And so, as a lot of things in the early days of the yacht club, it kind of led to a little bit of fisticuffs, and it led to a lot of bad will. So at that point, those 2 boats decided that they were not going to race in the Mackinac Race. They were going to race in the Macatawa Race. So basically, the boats in the Mackinac Race were the schooners Hawthorne, Alice, and Mistral. The yawls were Arcadia, Tanis, and Siren, and the sloops were Loretta, which was the preeminent boat of that class of that time. So you had the big boats, which were Venena and Vencedor and Amarita, and then basically they were the 60-foot boats. Lady Eileen was in a class of 30-foot boats, which were much more of the thoroughbred racers. So at that point in time, by 1905, you had the Lipton Cup, which was started by Thomas Lipton, who competed in multiple America Cups at that time and age. And basically, he established his own perpetual race called the Lipton Cup. And so Loretta had raced in the Lipton Cup in 1902, and then also in a newly established event called the Canada's Cup, which still continues to this day, and Loretta raced in that race as well. So anyway, it wasn't that there was it wasn't enough action on Lake Michigan's waterfront that day. The power boats were also lining up to race to Mackinac Island as well too. So off the Van Buren Street Gap, you had the Macatawa race, you had the Mackinac race, and then you had a motorboat race. All at the same time. The starting lines were a little different, and then you had a big storm coming in. So basically there was a lot of drama at the start. So basically the weather forecast, which was originally set with optimal winds out of the west at about 12 knots, just before the start, it did an abrupt and dramatic turnaround into a wicked northerly, which whipped Lake Michigan up into a frenzy. But the headlines of the day, again, we're going to get back, the headlines of the day were all the newspaper reporters, all the photographers were on the water because there were two plucky young ladies who would man a yacht in a hard race, heaven forbid. And again, Lady Eileen with Evelyn and Sara on board shocked the yachting world by having the audacity to dare to begin a 331 trip in a boat that was built at home and only 32 feet. Also, and in my research, what became really interesting was not only was this the first all-women's crew in any major race in the world, but also there were only two of them on board. Back then, you did not have a double-handed class as one of the classes in a lot of these yacht races. Now, double-handed is a very popular class. Some crews will basically do an all-crew in the Chicago, and then they'll double-hand in the Bayview or vice versa. So not only were these two ladies going to sail an all-women's crew, but there were only two of them at the time. And at that time, the race committee reserved the right to reject any entry that they did not consider to be a bona fide cruising craft or in their judgment was unseaworthy or other unfit to make the race. And so it's important to recognize that even though there was some pushback from the club members about, well, these ladies are out there, the race committee gave them the green thumb and basically said, hey, you guys are in there. And at that time, Miss Wright, who was 27 at the time, was described very chauvinistically as a pretty, dainty little woman with a slender little figure, soft brown hair, curls that supples in the wet lake breezes with her wistful brown eyes, but her hands are as callous and hard as any jack tar. So jack tar was the adjective that the guys used. They were all on board. They were jack tars, which was male sailors. So they basically said, yeah, she's pretty, she's dainty, but boy, she's got hands like a man. Miss Wright was asked at the time whether she was afraid, and she goes, oh dear no, I have sailed since I was 10 years old and a wee bit of a little girl. I'm game all right. If I get to Mackinac, I'll get to Mackinac if the boat holds out. And so basically with Wright on the tiller and Carey, her cousin, manning the sails, Lady Eileen basically was getting ready to start this race against 9 other boats. The conditions on the water were changing. They're changing sails. They're all getting ready to basically get the start of the race. So basically, they were over early. So they got the double, so when the boats cross the starting line, you get the starting gun. But if you hear a second shot, that means that somebody went over early and they had mistimed their start. So they had to circle back, get started again, and basically the account at the time, and again, you have to remember that all the spectators that day that were on the water were here to see these two ladies race. And basically in a written account, and basically she was getting the Caitlin Clark treatment 120 years before Caitlin. So anyway, basically they reported that Miss Wright showed the quality of her mettle as she saw the wind was lighter outside the harbor and could easily carry more canvas, more sail area, inside the harbor. So she sprang up to the main, undoing the reef points, and when all the little lines that were fastened down the reefs were cast off, she crept out on the boom, which is the large boom bang that is in front of the boat, with the agility of a boy, and basically started to unfurl and unleash the main so that she could change sails as the storm conditions were changing. So basically it was described as Lady Eileen swung into the wind and the two girls ran forward to the mast where the halyards were fastened to the pin rail. As they quickly made the sheet adjustments, in a heartbeat, the full mainsail was spread to the wind. There was no confusion. There was no messing up the ropes. These were not damsels in distress. This was done as sailor-like and as a matter of fact as any racing crew could have done in a difficult maneuver. So after ensuring that everything was all right, Miss Wright, clad in her yellow oilskins, disappeared down the hatch into what they call the green room. So if you go below deck, it's kind of nicknamed the green room because that's usually where all the water ends up at some point in time in the worst of conditions, and the water is all green and sloshy, so it's kind of nicknamed the green room. So basically, she's down below, and Sarah is steering the boat, and beforehand, basically, Miss Wright had also commented that I would have liked to have more crew with me, another girl for sure. It makes the work pretty hard on just the two of us, especially if we have to handle the canvas much or if we have to run into bad weather, which they did. It means a long watch for both of us. In bad weather, Miss Wright continued, I always have two on deck at all time. We had expected the third member, but she could not crew with us. She was not afraid. She just couldn't go. So basically, at this point in time, the big schooners had crossed the line. Mistral, Hawthorne, Alice, because Venena and Vencedor were not in the race, basically had made their way, and as at the start of a lot of the Lake Michigan to Mackinac Island races, everybody kind of heads to the Michigan shoreline. That's kind of the way that all the boats go. So you kind of make your way, and if you're fictitiously pointing at somewhere between St. Joe, South Haven, Saugatuck, Holland, that's where you're kind of pointing your vessel to kind of go into the wind. Generally, you're catching the sails and you're sailing over to the Michigan shoreline. So basically, what had ended up happening is basically the Chicago Yacht Club at the time had expressed little anxiety about Lady Eileen and her fair crew. Tommy Aitken, who was once a candidate for Commodore, basically said, there are a whole lot of sailors around here that don't know half about Lake Michigan as much as she does. She's got nerve, knowledge, and a wonderful endurance. She brought Lady Eileen here as a gift from her brothers. She'll get there, but the breezes have to be kind to her little boat. So as the race progressed, the weather worsened. Lady Eileen, Siren, and Loretta were all kind of in the same class together, and they were making their way to South Haven, Michigan. That was where they were pointing, potentially to seek refuge from the storm. It was reported outside of South Haven that Lady Eileen was in distress. Skipper George Pearl, who was the vice commodore at that time, was on Loretta. He owned Loretta. He was usually back then, the owners drove the boats. It was an owner-driven sport, and so Pearl basically is on Loretta, and they had arrived just ahead of Lady Eileen and had noticed that basically that Lady Eileen appeared to be waterlogged and helpless a few miles offshore. The ladies had climbed up onto the cabin trunk on deck, waiting for rescues because Lady Eileen was basically sinking at that point in time. Once in port, in South Haven, the boat was bailed out, dried out, and Miss Wright and Carey rested up, and then they started out on their adventure again. But what was interesting in all of this is that in 1905, so you have to remember, there aren't a lot of reports of all-women crews and all that stuff. So interestingly enough, a lot of the material that I got basically on the blow-to-blow, the description of the race was from Sara Carey, who did an article for the Indianapolis Star later that fall. So anyway, this is Lady Eileen. And so basically, you see the two ladies on board. You see, I believe this is Evelyn, and then Sarah is up front. And all the boats towed a little dinghy. Well, right before the race, basically, as the storm whipped up and everything got caught up, the dinghy detached and then kind of floated away, which leads to really another part of our story. So basically, what ended up happening, and this is a description from Sara Carey, after the race of what the conditions were like on the way to South Haven in the storm that they were in. This may have been because the upper part of the boat was dry, but at any rate, the cabin was beginning to fill with water. Miss Wright, Evelyn, had to devote all of her attention to pumping the water out of the below in the green room on Lady Eileen. This left Sara to do the steering, while under some circumstances it might be uncomplimentary to say a yacht woman was seasick. And under the conditions, it did not seem strange that the girl did experience a touch of that malady. And with this handicap, even though she was sick, she kept her place at the tiller all through the night while her companion, Evelyn, was busy at the pumps trying to keep the boat afloat, which was sinking under the weight of the water. So basically so Sara ends up describing the fact that they are just waterlogged, she's terrified, and basically it was a great relief when we saw some men putting some rowboats out to aid us. And it was high time we had assistance, for I feared that we could not have held out much longer, said Sara. We both loved the water, but Lake Michigan was no lily pond that night. It was a wonder that we were able to weather the storm, and would not have been able to do it if it were not for the other sailors that were looking out for us and helped us with our boat. Not long before that so it's interesting to say that basically it was amusing to see the way the men took the determination to push on and help us, and even though our boat was waterlogged and we were, in a position where we didn't know whether we were be able to continue the race or whether we were going to have to basically waylay in South Haven and the race was over. We all needed rest, said Sara, and all of that. Neither one of us wondered why we could not continue. We had passed through the worst of the ordeal. The news of our fight and the waves preceded us. There was much attention when we arrived in South Haven. And so it is well known that basically that the women, on board, basically felt that their race was over. But what ended up happening, they ended up drying out. They ended up basically getting some assistance to get the boat fixed up, and then they proceeded in the race. At that point, Mistral and Hawthorne, which were the race leaders, they were way up the Michigan shoreline. And at that point in time, Hawthorne, which was always known for finishing second, was kind of in the lead. But then off of Charlevoix, she ran into a sand reef and was stuck up for about 3 hours. So basically, while Hawthorne is stuck on the reef trying to move the boat back and forth to try to get it going again, Mistral passed her and ended up winning the race. And in the 1905 race, the race that Lady Eileen was in, to this day is the slowest race in Mackinac history. It took Mistral 96 hours, which is 4 days, to get to Mackinac Island. As I had mentioned earlier, in 1898, Venena, which won the first race, did it in 51 hours. So it wasn't the fact that this was 120 years ago, the boats were slow. It's just the wind conditions after the storm had passed through really were negligent, and so Mistral finished in 96 hours. And Hawthorne finished 3 hours behind her, which were the 3 hours that she was waylaid on that sandbar off of Charlevoix. At this point in time, Lady Eileen had been repaired, and so she was kind of making her way up the Michigan shoreline and was basically stopping at ports on the way up, because that's how we knew that she was continuing her race, because every port that she would pull into, it was like the fanfare. It was like, oh, these ladies are here. This is an amazing thing. And Muskegon, they would race out to greet them, and in Pentwater. And as they made their way, and they actually stopped on their way up to Mackinac on North Manitou Island, which to this day, I mean, people, I don't know, has anybody hiked North Manitou ever? Oh, there we go. All right. It's pretty much, they had some docking facilities back then. Most of the boats in the Mackinac race choose to go through the Manitous. Very few of them go around the Manitous because it's a shorter distance. You can cut through, even though you've got a lot of sandbars, you've got a lot of tricky areas. Most boats go around the Manitous. In this case, Lady Eileen decided that she was going to sail outside the Manitous, and maybe there was fresher breeze out there or whatever. So she put up for the night at North Manitou Island, and this was also chronicled by the reporters at the time. And then she finished the race second in her class, and she finished the race a week after the finishers did, but she finished the race. Back then, they didn't have the elaborate rules about stopping and getting repaired and continuing on. And so basically, not only did the ladies finish the race, but they were the first major finishers double-handed in a major yacht race in the United States and in the world. So again, this is a little, and we're going to kind of go through the slides here for a quick second. This is kind of what the starting line and what the Chicago skyline looked like at the time, at what they called the Van Buren Street Gap, which again is kind of where the Bean is, where the yacht club is. It's kind of that part of Chicago that extends out past the lighthouse and then out into Lake Michigan. And again, that's a shot of Mistral. And Mistral is basically the boat that basically won the race. Now, I can't confirm this, and my thought is that this could be Lady Eileen. That's about the discrepancy in size that you would see between a larger boat and a smaller boat, this being 60-some feet, this being 30-some feet. And as you see, you only see kind of a minimum of crew. There is no verification this is Lady Eileen, but that's what she would have looked like. And that's in comparison to the Mistral. And again, as they're all jockeying, the starting line is the same for the large boats and the small boats. And again, this is another shot of Mistral at the start of one of the other Mackinac races. And again, this is Lady Eileen. And as you can see, basically, this compartment right there, that's kind of the part that they were hanging on to as they were coming into South Haven under duress and under being waterlogged, so to speak. And again, at the time in Mackinac Island, the breakwater had not been established. What ended up happening is the larger boats would kind of make berth, and they had smaller boats that would shuttle them to the island. It was a great controversy at the time that a lot of the boats that were smaller, like Lady Eileen, that were 30-some feet, there was no protected place for them to be. And this schism in 1912 and 1913 caused the yacht club to basically decide that they were going to race to Harbor Springs rather than Mackinac Island. And then that was kind of at the time, they felt that the protected harbor in Harbor Springs was better. Mackinac Island State Commissions built a break wall and made it safer, so the race, Mackinac race returned to Mackinac Island in 1914. And again, these are just kind of some pictures of 1905 with the boats out in the water and kind of with the pennants and the flags and just kind of celebrating. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is the reporting. The Girl Tars past Muskegon. The sloop Lady Eileen, manned by Mrs. Wright and Carey, still in the Chicago-Mackinac race. And this was about a week after the start. And again, here we go, as I mentioned earlier, Eileen is at North Manitou, and the yacht manned by women as skippers, and the crew stop on their way to Mackinac Island. And again, the arrival on Mackinac Island, and basically, which led to this is kind of a picture of kind of what the big yachts at the time and the steamships that kind of would be on Lake Michigan. This is the dress of the age and the style of the age. This is after the roaring 90s. This is the first decade of the 1900s, the 20th century. And again, this was the little trophy that Lady Eileen won, being second in her class. It's a little silver pitcher that is still owned by the family to this day. And what is blessed enough, not only is Mr. Sheridan can attend to, that Evelyn Wright Crawford's basically grandchildren live in Saugatuck to this day and are very active here. But what ended up happening, so basically you see, this is the recorded finish in 1905 with Lady Eileen basically finishing in 418 hours and 36 minutes and 11 seconds. So basically that's her corrected time. But still, she finished. A lot of the big yachts at the time, Siren, Loretta, Tanis, did not finish. And so she, even though she finished in probably record slow time, she did finish. Aaron was the powerboat winner in that race, and to this day, as you know, Mackinac Island at the time had the Grand Hotel, was built in the 1880s, and was still very much the queen of the island, so to speak. And again, this is actually this photo, and this is from the State Historical Park Society in Mackinac. This is the Anheuser family that vacationed on Mackinac Island. And many of you know, Anheuser ended up merging with a gentleman by the name of Bush, and then started Anheuser-Busch. So they were on the island. And again, this was very much the style of the time. And again, this is the porch of the Grand Hotel and the way that everybody lived and dressed in the 1900s and the 1905s. And again, the Mackinac Cup that was instituted in 1906. And still to this day, there's layers on below with all the winners since then, but that trophy is still at the Chicago Yacht Club. This is the Mackinac Trophy that was started in 1927. This was the second trophy that's, for the, you have the first to finish, and then you have the winner on corrected time. So first to finish gets one trophy, and the corrected time gets the other trophy. This was the palatial Chicago Yacht Club building that they were going to build in Chicago, but wasn't built because of the Depression. And as you can see, it would have been the most spectacular yacht club in the world. And again, work got started on it, but as you notice the date, November 17th, 1929, all they did was pretty much put the shovel in the ground, and that was about it. And again, this is not a shot celebrating the fact that they were basically breaking ground, but this is kind of just the era of what the yacht clubs were like at the time. So I'm going to kind of pause for a quick second and kind of bring you kind of how and why Evelyn Wright ended up in Saugatuck, Michigan. So basically, Evelyn Wright, as I mentioned, had grown up in Chicago privilege, and and basically was really a pioneer of her time. When she lost her little dinghy, which was attached to Lady Eileen, a gentleman by the name of Andrew Crawford picked it up. And Mr. Crawford basically was from another prominent family of Chicago. He was a young entrepreneur. He was in his early 30s. And basically, Andrew picked up the dinghy, towed it back to the Chicago Yacht Club, and was waiting to see who would claim the dinghy. Probably had Lady Eileen on it or whatever. So later that fall, when Evelyn Wright returned to Chicago with Lady Eileen and met Mr. Crawford, they fell deeply in love, and within a few months after the 1905 race, they were married. So basically, they were married. The Crawford family had property in St. Joe and in Benton Harbor, and they took the train from Chicago and were married at 3 o'clock in the morning. It seemed like a shotgun marriage, but it wasn't. But apparently they were late because Miss Wright missed the train from Chicago and had to take the next train in. And they were married in St. Joe, and this is in 1905. Andrew Crawford was a registered member of the yacht club as well, too. They ended up getting married in 1905, and their first child was born in 1908. And at that point, the Crawfords were forming what was the Crawford Transportation Company. And the Crawford Transportation Company got its genesis in 1908, 1909, and started with and that's a picture of Evelyn Wright, and that's what she looked like on the deck of the time and stuff like that. And again, married at 3 o'clock in the morning. and with the young millionaire and the belle of Chicago in St. Joe. Rich man and girl sailor crowned romance at 3 a.m. So back then, there probably wasn't People magazine, there wasn't Variety, there wasn't Entertainment, but the society pages were probably more filled than the sports pages at that point in time. And again, Sara Carey, her cousin, was present at the wedding, and such. And then in 1905, in the fall, the Indianapolis Star did a feature section in their society column about how losing the race but winning a man and $1 million. So basically, this was the feature story. In the 1905, the family still has a copy of that paper from 1905, and I think they're trying to get it plated behind glass so it can be preserved a little bit. It's been kind of just in a shopping bag for 100 years. But anyway, when I was researching the story, trying to find out what happened to Lady Eileen, did she shipwreck? Did she sink? Was she sold? Was she broken apart? I contacted the Shipwreck Society out of Alpena that chronicles all the shipwrecks in the Straits of Mackinac. So I thought, well, maybe she just got waylaid up there, and with a lot of boats at the time, it sank, and you just kind of wrote it off. But they said no, she was not shipwrecked in Chicago, but they forwarded me a copy of the article. So anyway, when the Crawford Steamship Company got their start and got their genesis in 1909, 1910, they had 3 boats. They had the Arundel, they had the Tennessee, and they had the Mackinac. And the Mackinac, interestingly enough, as recorded history would show it, is that in 1913, when the Crawford Company was struggling and had to sell off some of their assets, George Arnold, who was the Postmaster General of Saugatuck, and actually was the founder of the Saugatuck, was the founder of the Arnold Transportation Company. And the Mackinac, which was one of the Crawford transportation boats, was one of the first boats in the Arnold fleet. What ended up happening is that, unfortunately, in 1912, 1913, pre-World War I, there was a lot of economic distress in that time, and basically the Crawford Company, which again would run steamships from Mackinac, or from Chicago, Illinois to Saugatuck, Michigan. And they would run, the passenger ferries, because this is before 196 and 94 and all that. And so basically, they had to sell off their assets in 1913. So basically, unfortunately, the Arundel burned down at the Red Dock here in Saugatuck. The Tennessee was sold to an entrepreneur and towed up to Manistee, where later it did burn down as well. And the Mackinac, which was one of the original boats in the Arnold fleet, basically was sold to a company in Rhode Island and only was part of the Arnold fleet for just a couple years. What I'm showing here is that this is a picture of Andrew Crawford, who was a young, dashing entrepreneur. These are the streets of downtown Saugatuck, correct, Jack?
Right, this is Culver Street. Right in the middle of the block. That's the corner of Griffin and Culver to the right-hand side there.
This is the Tennessee, which was one of the Crawford boats, obviously parked in front of the Great Pavilion. And this is a picture of the Arundel and the Tennessee. And again, like I said, the Arundel burned down at the Red Dock, which I believe the Red Dock is where the Keewatin used to be docked, correct?
There's a restaurant there today called the Red Dock. That's where that is.
And that's where the Arundel met her fate. Again, this is a shot of the Mackinac, which had the Crawford Transportation Company logo on it, but then again was sold to the Arnold fleet. And again, many of these boats would suffer their demise. They would burn down, but they had these steel hulls, so the hulls would be salvaged as barges. So even though the top compartments would disappear, the barges would survive for many, many, many years. And again, this is another shot of the Crawford Transportation Company and the big pavilion. How many here remember the big pavilion? How many were outside the night it burned down? Sad day. Though I can't imagine that structure being in downtown Saugatuck. It just seems like it doesn't fit in with where the lake is and everything. But again, it's one of the magnificent buildings. People would take these steamships up from Chicago, party all night in Saugatuck, and then they go back to Chicago a couple days later and such. That's maybe where. And again, so we're going to pivot back. So what ended up happening after Evelyn Wright married Andrew Crawford, and they had a couple children, and the Crawford company was going through financial distress, and in the roaring teens, so to speak, before World War I, Andrew Crawford basically the time and era and age and celebration kind of caught the best of him, and basically he and Evelyn parted ways and went through a divorce, and unfortunately in that day and age they were the society couple, and so their divorce made all the pages, and it just was very uncomfortable and unpleasant. So Evelyn took her children, the two young children, and moved to Saugatuck. The family had property here, and they had property in Benton Harbor, St. Joe. So in the teens, not only did this brave and daring woman, you know, have the adventure being out on the Mackinac Race with just her cousin, but, you know, back then had the strength and courage to leave her husband and take her children and move to another state and start over. And Evelyn did not just sit still, so to speak. She ended up with partners of Mr. Sheridan's family and other people, founded the Saugatuck Yacht Club in 1934. And her son, Robert, who by 1934 was probably in his late 20s, was the first Commodore of the club. And that's a picture of Robert, who is the father of two of the grandchildren of Evelyn Wright that live here in Saugatuck. Rich, who, I don't know, do you guys know Rich Crawford at all? Yeah. That's Evelyn's grandson and Robert's son, and then Gloria Gupta is in Chicago, and so they are actually the living grandchildren that are in Saugatuck from Evelyn Wright Crawford and such. So basically,
great-grandson is working at the Saugatuck Yacht Club.
Aha! Is it, how old?
He's a teenager.
I know that Gloria's daughter is a champion rower. And basically the scull rowing that she, which is also an Olympic sport. I'm not sure if she's been in the Olympics, but she is a champion rower who lives in Chicago. It's interesting that, you know, the family, the Wright and Crawford family basically took up roots here, part of the community, founded the yacht club. George was involved politically. They had their boats built. That is the original Saugatuck Yacht Club building in the 1930s, which was donated by Evelyn Wright Crawford. And it's no longer, I don't know if it's on the pilings of where the current yacht club is now. And that's another shot. A lot of the yacht clubs of that days were basically just boathouses. You know, they weren't fancy ornate clubs with restaurants and food and dining and such. They were just a place to store the gear, so to speak. And again, one of the races, and you have the big pavilion, one of the races that was also very famous and Evelyn Wright took part in many, many times was the Chicago-to-Saugatuck Race. It's funny because Jackson Park at the time was the prominent yacht club with Chicago, with Columbia on the waterfront. And Jackson Park actually started Lake Michigan Yachting News. It used to be called Jackson Park Yachting News. And then in its second year of publication in 1921, it became Lake Michigan Yachting News, of which all the yacht clubs around the ring of Lake Michigan were part of. But no, I mean, Jackson Park is just an elegant, elegant park and yacht club and such. Again, just another historical photo of the boats and yachts at its time. Carl Bird was a boat builder. The class that the Saugatuck Yacht Club used was called the Papoose. and the papoose was about a 17 or 18 footer little skiff. There were about a dozen of them built. I think the first one, Cirrus, was from your family, correct, Jack? And Carl built many of those papooses here. Evelyn went out east and bought a boat from Mower Company, Mower #1, and Mower was a famous designer and builder of boats out on the East Coast at Nevins Shipyard in Long Island. And she brought that boat back, which was a little bit bigger than a papoose, and nicknamed it the Chief. That was the Chief class, and there were 6 Chiefs that were built.
I sailed during that time. This was back in the 1940s. And I remember Mrs. Crawford coming down and raising the flags to start and stop the race. And she would take nothing out of us teenagers. She was right there, you know, to make sure that we towed the line and did everything according to the way she knew it had to be done in order to be safe and to enjoy a good race. And the papooses and the Mowers that became the Chiefs sailed on all of those.
Well, and so you must have been part, so Mrs. Crawford, in the 40s, during the war, started the youth sailing program at the yacht, so you were one of those sailors.
One of those sailors.
My goodness.
I was crew. It was due to a young man who invited me to be his crew. I had never set foot on a sailboat in my life. And then we sailed and just had such a good time. It was one of the highlights. And we anchored it. And then I was part of our yacht club and even helped move everything over to the other side of the lake.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, it's funny because in the way that you alluded to it, because everybody remembers it wasn't Evelyn, it was Mrs. Crawford.
Oh, yes,
And
it was Mrs. Crawford. Yes, indeed.
And when she did something like going out and purchasing a mower, she did everything according. So it's funny because when I talked to Rich, and he would talk about the fact that when you sat down at grandmother's house for dinner, that you sat very properly. You did things in a very formal manner.
Yes, indeed. I mean, she was. But there she would be down there pulling those halyards up, you know, to start the races. She would have on a very proper dress and her gray hair very neatly fixed and everything. I could just see her now. She was a very dear woman. She cared about us very, very much, and she wanted to pass her part of sailing, her love of sailing, and what she had learned through all of her years on to us, and she did that. She did that.
Wow. I can't think of a better way to kind of wrap up the talk than that is just unexpected and amazing and such. I mean, again, as alluded, she became definitely a significant part of the society and Saugatuck.
On the ground, man, with them.
And again, this is one of the wonderful photos that are here at the Douglas and Saugatuck and the Keewatin, which is another story for another day. I'm actually going up there in a couple weeks to see her. And then that's a picture of Evelyn Wright Crawford back in the teens and the 20s. But again, any questions?
Did you ever find out what happened to her boat?
It was registered at the yacht club up until 1913. And again, I think that that after 1913, there is no record of her. That was at the same time that I think that the Crawford Transportation Company was going through their financial challenges, and it's possible that, you know, and again, trying to find George Wright's records and stuff like that, but there's no record of Lady Eileen being registered after 1913, and that's when Mrs. Crawford Crawford moved to Saugatuck with her children. And again, she had boats here in Saugatuck. She had a sailboat that was registered with the club, and a power boat, a motorboat, and then, I think her family had 2 papooses, and then your family had one, Cirrus. And again, I think that there were 12, and again, and maybe you might be able to help me. Does anybody have a papoose in their garage or in their barn? Or I have been trying, that's one of the, in addition trying to find out what happened to Lady Eileen.
Then we transferred over to Lightnings.
Right.
Eventually, they were being built up in Holland. And when I graduated from high school, my parents gave me a Lightning for my graduation.
Wow.
So that was really exciting. I loved it. Then I married a man who never swum or been. So yeah, he was not a sailor, I will say that.
Well, and even in every yacht club, you have your divide, you have your schism between the sailors and the power boaters.
Yeah.
And a lot of us young sailors like to sail and do all the work and do everything when we're younger, and then as we get older, it's like, it's nice just to turn on that key, and such. Any other thoughts and questions? And again, what was interesting in the 1905 race, it was the slowest race in Mackinac Race history to this date. Since then, there have been 6 all-women crews in the Mackinac race. 1950 on Venturin, Loretta McNeil basically got the boat, allowed her husband to basically take an all-woman crew in 1950. What was interesting in that, Wallace Kirkland, who was a famous life photographer, was on board that boat, not as crew, but like just to kind of cook and take pictures. And so he was going to do a huge photo layout for Life magazine in 1950 of the all-women crew on Venturin. But the same week that the race happened, the Korean War started, and so that story was shelved. It never made the pages of Life magazine, but I have found the 700 photographs that Mr. Kirkland took, and they are just fascinating. And again, if we had more time, maybe that's the time for another talk. I'd love to share the photographs that Mr. Kirkland took of that all-woman crew. 1976 in Sea Spray was the 3rd one. 1998, excuse me, the 100th anniversary of the first race. Hey Jude was the 4th one. Moxie, which is from Holland, Michigan, and Laura McCrannon. Does anybody know Laura, the McCrannons at all?
What about Judy Hallisey? Did she have an all-female?
She did not. In fact, so her dad was Harry Nye, one of the great, yep, and so Judy, in fact, I met with her probably 3 or 4 times. I did a story on her, so she said, I always I never wanted to have an all-women crew. I just wanted to be one of the guys. And she never sailed with her dad because her dad had his guys on gale. But she sailed, so basically, and she also, great point. So Judy, basically Nye, Harry Nye was her father, champion sailor, won the Mackinac race twice. Judy married Ted Turner right after college. In fact, she would joke that she taught Ted how to sail. And she probably did. And she is the mom of Ted's oldest 2 children. And so her first race in the Mackinac race was in 1970. That was also Ted Turner's first race. And Ted Turner would joke about the fact that, Mackinac race, it's a mill pond. It's a piece of cakes. He brought American Eagle, which was an America's Cup boat, to sail in 1970, and it turned out to be one of the biggest gales in Chicago race history, was that way. So you had Judy Nye on one boat, and then Ted Turner on another boat. Ted was first to finish. Judy finished second in her class. that race in 1970. My uncle, Dave Howell, actually won that race on corrected time. So he was on a boat called Decision. But Judy raced in 37 Mackinacs. She won several times. She was the, again, Russ always said that she just won. In fact, I can quote her specifically here really quick. She just wanted to be one of the guys on board. And she would steer, she would captain. She had been on other races with all-women crew, and obviously on the smaller boats, she was a champion sailor, like in Lightnings and the other two-person boats and such as that. But in the Mackinac race, she was always on a men's crew and such. And then anyone who knows Judy this day, she loves her glass art. She's brilliant in her glass art, but she's also really passionate about her sailing days when she was younger and when she did sail. And then also, even though her marriage with Ted didn't work out, from what I understand, he came here and threw her 80th birthday party here in Saugatuck. He kind of came and did that for her. But Judy is an amazing story. But no, to answer your question, she never had an all-women crew. The sixth all-women crew was Venturin, which was last year, and they finished third in their class. And then Venturin with a mixed crew raced in the Newport to Bermuda race this year. And that's Marion Hoskins and her husband, John. But Marion was the skipper of Madcap last year, which was the sixth all-women's crew. This year, there was no all-women's crew in the race. They had a new, what was called mixed crew, which emphasized having a 50-50 crew. So many boats went that direction rather than having an all-lady crew this year. Well, thank you for your patience and everything.